Welcome to an accurate history of the Bronze Age collapse.
Mostly accurate.
Around 1200 BC, the Mediterranean was hit by earthquakes, volcanoes, and a mass famine that basically ended their entire world. You've already heard how that toppled the Hittite Empire, and won't be surprised to hear how that caused Egypt to go through 7 pharaohs in 15 years. When last we visited the land of sand and pyramids, the old king Merneptah had died and left an unclear chain of succession behind him. Within a year of his death, his 2 sons were fighting over the throne and a Canaanite side piece princess. In the royal temples, names of pharaohs had been inscribed, removed, chiseled, then wiped clean again, in a never-ending mural fight that left no one but the graffiti artists happy. Amenmesse was killed within 2 years of seizing the throne. Seti then violated his brother's tomb in revenge and removed all records of his reign.
So we don't even know how he died. In fact, we don't even know how he lived. He basically contributed nothing to history. He just sort of filled the throne like he filled his brother's wife for a couple years.
Seti himself kicked the bucket within a few years of his brother. He also seems to have contributed nothing to history except a civil war, and his country was worse than when he took it over, with papyrus rolls from his reign detailing mass corruption and bribery amongst his officials.
Speaking of,
Bay is back, baby! Turns out you can't keep a scheming, power-hungry Canaanite brother-in-law down. While his Canaanite sister had been sitting on some pharaohs, Bay had quietly put his own butt on the throne of Egypt, becoming the power behind the throne that took care of minor things like running the palace, day-to-day finances, and overseeing civil works. By keeping people paid, fed, and busy, Bay had amassed a huge amount of influence, which he then used to put his next hand-picked pharaoh on the throne, his baby nephew. Due to his sister's recent civil war bed-hopping, it was unclear exactly who Siptah's father was, but he was definitely a pharaoh. Probably. Too young to rule on his own, Bay volunteered himself as regent until Siptah came of age, which is what he really wanted anyway. Wherever there's a statue of Siptah, Bay is carved towering over him. When Siptah got a tomb, Bay got one next door, but slightly larger. Bay's reign was like the autopilot from Wall-E. With each passing year, he pushed the boy pharaoh Siptah a little further out of the picture. But at least one person in the royal court seems to have seen the quite literal writing on the wall. Tuazret, Seti's former sister wife and daughter of the older pharaoh Merneptah. When Bay was named as regent, she had herself named as co-regent, either as a show of support or a check and balance. For a long time, Egyptologists assumed Tuazret must have been as crooked as Bay, a concubine lover for the Canaanite chancellor, because wherever Bay put his own name, hers was listed below it. He got a pyramid, she got a pyramid. Recent discoveries, though, show a different story for Tuazret. When Siptah came of age to rule in his own right, he magically disappears from history, almost as if a scheming uncle was unwilling to let go of power and smothered Siptah in his sleep. Or maybe he got a cold, who knows. But Bay stood to benefit regardless. He stepped out from behind the throne and sat down on it. Shockingly, the people of Egypt who worshipped their rulers as living gods were unwilling to accept a low-born foreigner as their new ruler. Cue the pitchforks. Tuazret named herself Pharaoh to take control, and declared herself as Siptah's chosen agent from the afterlife. Bay was labeled a traitor, and another civil war broke out. But this time, it wasn't just Egypt that faltered. Sub-kings and governors who depended on Egypt for economic and military support were cut off from them yet again, and were sitting ducks.
enter Irsu, stage right.
Canaan had been a proverbial pebble in the sandals of Pharaoh ever since its occupation. In the waning power of Egyptian rulers, the small tribes of Canaan had grown increasingly belligerent. Around the time of Siptah's death in 1191 BC, a single ruler emerged to unite the tribes. A strong man leading an angry people, united by their hatred of Egyptian oppression. A man named Su, who dares you to laugh at that. This man who made himself Ir-Su, as the Egyptians said it, looted the temples, raided the treasuries, and declared an independent kingdom where Egyptian gods were no longer welcome. Faced with the impossible task of suppressing an upstart revolt at home while fighting a war abroad, Tuazret amputated the gangrenous arm. Canaan was granted semi-autonomy in exchange for certain mineral rights.
Because even in times of war, the spice must flow.
This gave her the time she needed. Bey was caught and executed, but victory came with a steep price. Irsu was either unwilling or unable to stop the chaos he had begun. His revolt swept on and brought Canaanite warbands to raid directly into Egypt itself. It's worth mentioning that this mass arrival of a band of seaborne brigands coincides with the likely dates for the Trojan War, and in some versions of the story, Tuazret is named as the pharaoh of Egypt during Homer's epic. Some accounts of the Trojan War even have Helen of Troy and Paris being blown off course and landing in Egypt, with a few authors even claiming Helen stayed there for the duration of the fighting. If any pharaoh had sympathy for a beautiful young woman forced into a political marriage that only wanted to avoid war and labyrinthine politics, it would have been Tuazret. These constant entanglements, concessions, and raids were too much for many of the old hardliners, so they brought out the age-old conservative rallying cry. What Egypt really needed was to roll the clock back 50 years. Wasn't Egypt still great? How were they admitting defeat to barbarians without a fight? And worst of all, how did they wind up with a pharaoh who openly proclaimed herself a woman? The nerve! The story of the Bronze Age collapse starts with a Ramses, and it ends with one. Ramses III and his father, Setnakte, stepped into this chaos and put a firm hand on the tiller. As grandson and great-grandson of Ramses II, they felt they had just as much claim to the throne as these upstarts. Armies flocked to their banner. Tuazret was deposed after only 2 years of rule. Her tomb was ransacked, her name scrubbed from the walls, and her time as a pharaoh removed from all future official lists and records. Setnakte drove the foreign invaders out of Egypt, where they left a trail of stolen loot in their wake. They were so desperate to escape his wrath. That same gold would then be used to redecorate Tuazret's tomb, which was repurposed to hold Setnakte instead, because Setnakte's reign as pharaoh was brief, just long enough for him to stabilize the political situation and establish his son, Ramses III, as his undisputed successor to the throne. And then he died, another in a long chain of highly suspicious pharaoh deaths. But that reign was long enough. It gave Egypt time to forge a united front against the storm that was coming. The Sea Peoples had finished their sack of the Hittite Empire and moved south down the Levant coastline, toppling one client kingdom after another. Kings from every nation begged each other for help, but no one was in a position to respond. They were cut off and destroyed, one at a time, by the approaching horde.
But Ramses III had a plan, and is remembered as the last great warrior pharaoh for a reason.
Knowing that his lands would be next, Ramses drew a line in the sand, stockpiling his garrison at Jahi with supplies and mobilizing an army to intercept the Sea Peoples before they left Lebanon. In Ramses' own words, "My charioteers were warriors, and all good leaders ready of hand. The limbs of their horses were quivering, ready to crush their foreigners under their feet. Those who reached my boundary, their seed is not. Their heart and soul are finished forever and ever." But despite this victory, they were called the Sea Peoples for a reason. Ramses had crushed their land army, but the main naval assault sailed right past him. Ramses rushed back to Egypt before the invaders could make landfall. Expecting an assault of this kind, he had left an army assembled along the Nile Delta to await for his return. But this time, he couldn't depend on the famed Egyptian chariots for a victory. The ground was too marshy for chariot actions, so instead, he posted ranks of archers along the banks, and when the Sea Peoples sailed into the mouth of the river, they stayed hidden until the enemy fleet was in among the reeds. Then Ramses led a flotilla of riverboats to block them in. The pharaoh's archers riddled the Sea People's ships with arrows. Those that leapt overboard drowned in the Nile, and any that made it to shore were executed on the spot. Ramses' victory at the Delta saved Egypt from the destruction that felled the other great Near Eastern empires. But the campaign had left his army like house cleaners for Airbnb, broke, exhausted, and sick to death of seamen. So to ensure the victory would bring a lasting peace, he carved off the new kingdom of Philistia. The pharaoh couldn't control the growing powers of Canaan, and had the Sea Peoples act as a buffer state instead. 1179 BC is remembered as the year that civilization collapsed. Even though Ramses was able to slow the decline, he would still be the last great pharaoh. In the 29th year of his reign, the air itself clouded over, likely from yet another volcanic eruption. This descent into actual darkness marks the end of the Bronze Age and the arrival of the Age of Iron, fueled by a need for metal tools when access to tin dried up. But even while the world around him collapsed due to famine, strife, and civil wars, like an aging rock star, Ramses III died like he lived, surrounded by a harem of women who all wanted to have his babies. Unfortunately, that also meant a concubine slit his throat while he slept so her son could be the next pharaoh. During their trial, a few of the more enterprising wives then slept with the judges for reduced sentences. They were caught in the act, which implies a giant courtroom harem orgy with the judges while Ramses' newly mummified body watched it all from the evidence table.
So clearly the Dark Ages weren't all bad.
And that's your mostly accurate history of the Bronze Age collapse. If you enjoyed this humorous history, tell me what events you'd like to hear me cover next. Subscribe to the channel for more, or join the Patreon and help support in their production. But regardless, thanks for watching.